Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to Network Experts Voice Deep Dive, Module 6 for Media Resources. We've looked at the methodology on other days, expected outcomes. So for today, we are assuming that you come to the class with a basic understanding of conferencing, transcoding, basic understanding of music on hold, hopefully both unicast and multicast, but we'll certainly go into just about every aspect of the multicast. And then also RTP media and codecs is going to play a big role in terms of transcoding and MTPs. And then DTMF standards in general. So let's look at a deep dive to CCIE voice blueprint mapping. We're focusing on media resources today, which pretty much directly correlates to the 7.00 implement and troubleshoot media resources section of the voice blueprint. Conference bridging directly translates to 702 conference bridges, transcoding to transcoder, music on hold to music on hold, and then media resource preference and redundancy. We're certainly going to talk about that in detail. And then also annunciator and MTPs. And those really fall in with other CUCM media resources. So taking a look at basic codec rates and complexity to begin with. One of the things we can keep in mind and know about the CCIE Voice Lab is that we will be studying, or we will be using in the lab, so we should be studying with what are called PVDM2s, packet voice DSP modules. Now there's the original PVDMs, and there were various different chipsets for those. There are the PVDM2s, and there's a few different chipsets for those. The newest is the one that we'll be using, which is the C5510 chipsets. And then, of course, there are now PVDM3s that work with the newer ISRG2 routers, and those are not on the exam. So there is some differences as to what is supported by what. We'll actually take a look at that. But in general, if we're just talking about codecs in general, we divide things up into complexities. Really, how complex is the algorithm for the digital signal processor, the DSPs, to run, and so therefore how many clock cycles, and more specifically we refer to them as channels. We either refer to them as channels or MIPS, millions of instructions per second, and we'll typically refer to them as channels. And the way that you're going to calculate and decide, first of all, for the lab, you probably won't have to do much calculation in terms of channels. You will have enough DSP channels, DSP resources, PVDM, assigned to you. Each PVDM chip on top of a DIMM. Okay, so they are referred to as the DIMMs, the dual inline memory modules, even though it's not memory per se. It's an ASIC on that form factor of a DIMM. And we've got individual chips. So these individual chips are the DSPs, and each DSP can handle 16 channels, at least for the PVDM2's C5510 chipset. Now, there is a PVDM2-8. What this is actually only half of a DSP is essentially on the single DIMM that you would get. Looks like a full one, but really only half of it's enabled, so you're only getting half of the processing. But we typically look at things in relation to PVDM2-16 or 32, which is 2 chips, or 64, which is 4 chips on a single module. And then we can have multiple modules. We'll look at how we can pool resources together and what they're used for. So first off, what the chips, what the DSPs are used for, it really falls into one of 4 categories. One being voice termination, When we say voice termination, we're typically talking about TDM trunks, so time division multiplexing trunks, T1 PRI or T1 CAS or E1 of those various flavors, FXO, FXS, and then even BRI modules. So whatever kind of voice TDM modules we have, that's what we are talking about when we refer to voice termination. Then we have the ability to use DSPs in iOS now for MTPs, media termination points, and we're going to talk a good deal about those. We also have the ability to use them for conference bridging or for transcoding. When we provision these, we determine, first of all, the DSPs, the PVDMs, are referred to as a voice-card. And we're going to look at a show inventory command today and determine what kind of modules we have. Tomorrow we'll look at further in terms of what kind of TDM voice termination modules we have, T1, E1, etc. But today we'll use the show inventory command to look at specifically the PVDMs, where they're located very specifically in the router, how to refer to them, how to configure them, which is under the voice-card command, and then the slot or subslot that they happen to be a part of. And then we'll take a look at ways to pool them together for various pieces of hardware installed in the router, how to enable them for DSP services so that we can create, and we'll certainly go into creating DSP farms and the three various pieces that we can do there, which are the transcoder, the MTP, and the conference bridges we just mentioned. We'll also take a look at MTPs that are not using any DSP resources, so related to media but not related to DSPs, so used in iOS software only. In terms of the codecs, when we configure the voice-card command, in years back, if anyone recalls, we used to have to specify medium or high complexity. Now what this would do is this would essentially provision or set aside all of the DSPs on that particular voice card for that complexity of algorithm, whether it was medium or high. We didn't really have the ability to choose low complexity codecs. No, there are some that we see here, talk about in just a moment. And that was essentially that we would always need, at least always need, medium complexity codecs, or at least that was the rationale. And so by doing so, if we enabled medium complexity algorithms, then we provisioned enough of the DSP resources for both medium and, of course, for low. If we chose high complexity, then it provisioned all of the DSP resources on that DIMM. Okay, so all of the individual chips for high complexity, which of course would allow for medium complexity and low as well. And so probably, I can't remember when it was, probably around, might have even been in 11 code, or maybe it was early 12. I think right around the time that the PVDM2s came out, we had the ability to choose something called complexity flex, and this actually became the default. So we don't even think about it anymore. Many people maybe have not even tried to configure this under voice card, but the default now is the flexible complexity codec. So what this means is that DSP by DSP, we have the ability, so if we've got our say this is our ISR 2811 router. Okay? Inside of here, we've got essentially the motherboard. And on the motherboard, we've got the ability to place these DSPs. or PVDMs. PVDM2s more specifically. PVDM3s can go on the ISR G2. PVDM2s can go directly on the motherboard of the older ISR routers, the 2811s, 3800s, so forth. And then the older PVDMs can only go, they cannot go on a motherboard directly of either a ISR G2, or the older 2600s, 1760s, 3700s. Instead, they have to actually go on a network module, NMHDV, network module high density voice. So these PVDMs have individual chips on them. Haven't really left enough room for more than two. Okay, so these are our DSPs. On the PVDM. Now, of course, we also still have the ability on the newer ISR routers to have network module slots. This is an entire network module slot, currently open. And inside of there, we could shove in a there's the little handle on it. And there got our voice slots, or sub slots, really. We'll call them sub slots. That's what the router calls them. And then within the sub slots, we can, of course, add on individual cards that have ports. Like possibly a VWIC 2-2 MFT -T1 -E1. And we'll talk more about those tomorrow. Incidentally, those are what are on the exam, is the VWIC 2s. The difference between the VWIC 2 and the VWIC is the fact that I can have either T1 or E1, which means I have to decide. I have to configure that globally with the card type command. And the one difference from the racks that we have is that we have the VWIC, just the VWIC. So they're already decided for you. They can only either be a T1 or an E1. You don't need that card type command. And just remember that you absolutely will need that card type command in the lab, because we know the equipment versions, because Cisco publishes it, and they are the VWIC 2s. So that's all I'll say about that today. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. The only reason we didn't upgrade all those cards is that, well, they're really expensive, $2,000 a piece, at least list price, and we've already got, many racks provisioned with 4 routers each and multiple slots per router. Okay, so let's take a look at, real briefly, the router. Go ahead and bring up corporate headquarter router here. And let's do a show inventory on our 2811. Notice that we see here we have the 2811 chassis. It tells us the serial number in case we care about that. It tells us that we have a 2-port T1 voice interface card. It tells the model number, VWIC 2MFT T1. And this is the important bit here. Let me just, this is on slot 0, sub-slot 0. And then we also have a PVDM2, Roman numeral 2, DSP SIM, sorry I said DIM, it is actually SIM, all the DSPs are on one side, with 3 DSPs on slot 0, subslot 4, and it tells us the model number, PVDM248. Okay? So I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Get confused. Very quickly. Any confusion? Okay. So we're taking a look mainly at the PVDM and specifically slot 0, subslot 4. So with the ISR routers having the ability to have assets directly on the, and I actually did forget to key in one potential asset here, or one set of assets here on the router that will make a difference. We have the ability to have four voice subslots. Well, actually, subslots in general, they don't really have to be voice. Directly on the motherboard itself. Okay, so because we have the ability to have slots directly on the motherboard, and we also have or subslots rather, and we have the ability to have one, or depending on the router type we have, if we have a 3845, we have the ability to have 4 of these network modules. We've got the ability to have network modules, which are slots and then individual cards within the network module, so those are subslots. So the naming or numbering convention of the router is that it reserves slot 0 for the motherboard. So the motherboard is essentially slot 0. So this network module here, I'm actually going to write these in brown so they correlate with the markings down here. So this network module is going to be slot 1. Count canonically, of course, beginning at 0. And then each of these individual subslots here will be subslot 0, 0, and then 1. Okay, so 0 right here and 1 right here. So the router has subslots, and it has subslot 0, subslot 1, 2, and 3. So that's where here we saw slot 0, so this is the VWIC 2MFT. We saw slot 0, subslot 0. So we know that that VWIC happens to be, this VWIC right here, happens to be in this exact slot or subslot. And we also know that this PVDM, which is in slot 0, subslot 4, subslot 4 is an internal subslot being used directly on the motherboard for our PVDMs. The 2811 happens to have 2 of those. So it's important that we know what's where. Why? Well, first of all, when we configure voice cards, we only refer to the slot number. So if on our router here, we were to do a show run pipe 2 section voice dash card, we would see that we have voice card 0. Note we do not have voice card 0 subslot or voice card 0/4. Okay, if this were one of these two-port controllers, the two MFT T1s are denoted by controllers. So if I did a show run pipe to section, it's going to mess up where all those lines fall. I understand that, but T1s, yeah, let's just do section T1. So I've got 0/0/0 and 0/0/1. So the first one is going to be the network module, which in this case is the motherboard, so slot 0. The second one is going to be the subslot. So here we're talking about subslot 0 here. And then the third one, which I'm hitting the dead zone there on my monitor, is the port number. Okay, so the port number is also 0, and then here is the second one, and this is 1. So that's how we look at the naming convention. So given that model, we would assume then that voice card maybe would be 0/0, because we've got, or rather 0/4, because we've got at least 2 of the slots available, or subslots available for PVDMs directly on the motherboard. We can have more than one PVDM SIM card. And then to further that, we can have up to 5 DSPs per SIM. So a single inline memory module, we could essentially say this is 0/4/1, or 0 actually, if we're counting canonically, if we're accessing this first DSP here on subslot 4 on the router's slot 0. However, iOS doesn't let us get that granular when we're defining attributes for this DSP or this voice card. Okay, so it doesn't even let us define, not only does it not let us define separate attributes for the individual DSPs, but it doesn't even let us define individual attributes for the different SIM cards on a given slot, like a motherboard or a network module. So if we had a network module 1, it was an NMHDV, and we had 1 or 2 more PVDM2, and of course it would be an NMHDV2 at that point. We had 1 or more PVDM2 DSP cards, they would simply be referred to as voice card 1 rather than voice card 1/0, 1/1. They would just be voice card 1. So anything that we did to the entire voice card would really be done to any and all of the DSPs on any and all of the SIM slots or subslots within that either network module, if that's what we're talking about, or on the motherboard or wherever. So that's important that we know that we're affecting all of those PVDM2s. Now on this router we only have 1 PVDM2 SIM card, but we do have 3 DSPs on there. But on routers that we have multiple, we can affect differently if we have one on a NMHDV, another on another NMHDV, and another set on the motherboard. We can affect those 3 separations, kind of partition those off for different capabilities, but we cannot affect them any more granularly than that. So that's one thing to note. And when I say affect them differently, I mean in terms of, let's say, complexity, which is best to keep at flex today. That way it can dynamically allocate, and that's what we're getting ready to talk about. But we need to break this down first. Dynamically allocate capabilities between PVDMs. However, or allocate or provision differently between SIM cards relating to whether they can pool their resources together, which we'll talk about here briefly, or whether they can provide services for actually DSP farm type commands. MTP, conference bridge, and transcoder are DSP farm commands. Functions. So when we talk about the flexible complexity, what we're actually saying is that anywhere here within voice card 0, any of these, we have the ability per PVDM, so per individual chip on there, if we're using flex, to say this chip can be set aside for high complexity and this chip could be set aside for medium complexity, which also supports low, but we don't ever only support low, we mentioned. So how would we determine that if we can't individually configure them? Well, it's actually determined kind of live on the fly, real time, by the individual calls that get processed there. So one of the things to note is that if there are 16 channels per DSP, and then there's multiple DSPs, we have 3 here. There's multiple DSPs per SIM card. Then in this case we have 16 times 3, we've got 48, but we can do or whatever is affecting any one or two or multiple channels on this DSP, it's essentially locked for that function. Okay, so one DSP cannot be split up into multiple functions. I could not have one DSP, well, here in our configuration we've been using so far, and we really haven't talked too much about them, that's the lecture for tomorrow for gateways, but we've been using 3 voice channels, 3 bearer channels on our ISDN PRI circuits. Now, just because we're using 3 voice channels does not necessarily equate to 3 bearer channels for ISDN, does not necessarily equate to 3 PVDM channels. It could equate to 3, it could equate to 6, depends on the complexity. It tends to be the case, and I say tends to be because by chipset, by iOS version, and how it implements a given algorithm against the chipset, capabilities change in terms of how many channels need to be allocated. So it's not easy or really too plausible or possible to say, well, you need 2 channels for a bidirectional voice call if it's medium complexity, and you need 4 channels if it's high complexity. It's not really just safe to say anything like that. It really depends on per chip, per iOS, and then what you're trying to do with it. The best thing to do in real life always is to use the DSP calculator, and I'll mention where that's at in a moment. Actually, I could probably go ahead and bring it up, I suppose. And so what I've done is actually just logged into the website, and I've gone to support. So just clicked on support, and over here we've got tools and resources. We can click on see all, and click on that, and then show all tools. We can just do a search or scroll down, and we've got a DSP calculator here. This will bring up another box. And this DSP calculator asks us to choose by router model. Okay, so let's say, for instance, 2811. You're not going to have access to this in the lab. And given everything else I've said, this is the reason I'm saying you probably will not be asked to do anything regarding calculations. But if you were, I'll show you how to deal with that as well, of course. Router iOS. But I'm also bringing it up to say you should really never try to just calculate these things on your. I don't want to say you should never try. You should certainly read the documentation I'm going to point out and understand how the chipsets affect various tasks or functions that you're trying to perform in various iOS versions. However, it's probably always safe, if you have access to it, to use the DSP calculator. So let's say we're running 12422T. We've got these onboard HWIC slots, our high-speed WIC slots or WAN interface card. Of course, they can be VIC, voice interface cards as well. So we tell it, let's say we've got a PVDM, a VWIC, VWIC-2 MFT-T1. It tells us the maximum channels would be 48. Okay, if we told it a VWIC-2 T1, then it's actually asking us how are we configuring those as T1s or E1s. It's going to know, 60 versus 48 still. How many low and medium complexity codecs? So we have the ability to put in low complexity codecs, which we'll get back to the slide, but we had briefly showed there. G711 is one of those. In fact, it tells us right here, low complexity codecs are G711. Clear channel, we'll mention maybe tomorrow. Medium complexity codecs are G729A, so Annex A, which is a lower complexity. The whole idea of Annex A was it was a lower complexity algorithm, G729AB. And then high complexity codecs are G729 straight, so G729 R8, and then G729 Annex B, which adds in VAD capabilities. And we all know VAD is bad. It was great 10 years ago with low-speed frame links, but it's bad for a lot of reasons. It clips your voice, and we just don't need to use it today. G723 for low speed, G728 typically for video conferencing, ILBC, the Internet Low Bitrate Codec, GSM, typically used to interact with, obviously, cell carriers or mobile carriers. Modem relay versus modem and fax pass-through, those are low complexity. We can choose, how many codecs, maybe 2 G711 and 10 G729 calls, whatever. Do we have anything in a network module? Are we using DSP sharing, which we're about to talk about? Secure voice, and H320, which is, H320 is, if you happen to know, of course, ISDN video conferencing versus H323, which can be voice or video conferencing, but on IP. So H320 would be typically a H320 to H323 gateway. So bridging the ISDN video conferencing over to the IP world. And then it asks us about transcoding, secure transcoding, universal transcoding, which we'll talk about today, secure universal, and then conferencing. And depending on whether we want 8-party, 16-party, or 32-party conferences. So if I enter 1 here, that's one 32-party G711 only participant conference. Notice we cannot have a 32-party conference with G729 or G722, and notice that we cannot have a 16-party conference with the ILBC, the Internet Low Bitrate Codec. And then we have secure conferencing, which regardless of the codec, we can only have 8 parties per conference. Also note, when it comes to PVDMs in terms of not being able to share, if we've got 3 people on an 8-party conference, or I should say 3 people conferencing using, let's say, a G711 codec, we have essentially used up one 8-party conference, regardless of whether there's 3 or 4 people. This cannot be separated into, let's say there's 4 people, it can't be separated into 2 4-party conferences. It's one 8-party conference whether we have 3 people or 8 people on. Likewise, if we're using a 16-party conference, because we're enabling, maybe G711 and 729, same thing happens. And then it tells us basically what we need. So in this case, we need quantity 1 of the PVDM2 32. Now, if we had originally told it that we were using a GSR router, a 2911, with, let's say, 15.1T, then it's going to tell us something different. Most likely it's going to say that we want a PVDM3, say here, and then motherboard DSP type. Which one do we want to support? Okay, we tell it, and it tells us a PVDM3 16. Looking back at our infrastructure here, we have talked about the fact that we can have individual assets assigned to a DSP, so we can have voice termination. So we started to say if we had 3 channels, like we've had in most of our labs so far, probably most of them that we'll be using. Sometimes we'll go higher. We are still using all of the 16 channels. They're essentially reserved for one of those DSPs. Now, within certain DSP farm functions, we can, to some degree, use multiple channels on a DSP. So maybe you only have a DSP, PVDM2 32 in your router. So this is 2 DSPs, each with 16 channels. If you begin using one for voice termination, so for a TDM PRI circuit, for instance, then you've locked up that one. You might as well go ahead and use all the channels, but you've locked up that one. And then we have the ability to use individual resources within the other DSP for various things like, let's say, I could have conference bridging and transcoding. Those could share resources within a DSP as long as they're, supporting the proper codecs that will allow for those. What I can't do, well, we already mentioned I can't have the two shared back and forth between TDM and DSP farm resources or functions. What I can do, however, I do have the ability to allow, let's say, a voice card. Let me choose a different color. Maybe I've got a voice VWIC T1 up here on my network module HDV2, NMHDV2, and I have no DSPs internally here, no DSPs at all. But I want to be able to enable voice termination for this, slot 1, subslot 0, T1, 0, and 1. What I do have the ability to do is something called DSP pooling, which allows me to take the resources from one slot. In this case, the motherboard is the slot 0, and share those DSP resources up to another slot. It's called sharing or pooling. More specifically, it's called DSP pooling. I suppose it just depends. If you're in iOS, it's called DSP pooling. As we just looked at the calculator, it was called DSP sharing. So when we're pooling these resources, whether they are here on slot 1, the DSPs, and we want to share them to slot 0 so that we could have a voice card here, or whether they're on slot 0 and we want to share them up to slot 1, or of course if we have a larger router and maybe they're on, we have an NMHDV that just has nothing in it but a bunch of DSPs. I think there's 5 slots or 5 subslots in there, and we can put maybe 5 PVDM2 60s, and we don't have any voice cards on it, but we do have other NMHDVs that have voice cards and the motherboard. We can enable DSP sharing. This is found under the command voice card 0, and it's the command DSP farm. Now, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because DSP farm sounds like a farm of DSPs that you would use for DSP farm functions like conferencing, transcoding, and MTP, the 3 that we have available to us. And they're actually replacing the command. Depending on the version of iOS you put that command in, it will tell you that they're replacing it with DSP pooling as the new command because it more effectively communicates what's actually happening there. But for right now, the command is still, and has been for a long time, DSP farm. But I want to clear that up because a lot of people have the misconception that DSP farm enables DSP farm resources, or that you have to use the DSP farm command maybe if you're using the older PVDM 1, essentially the first version, first generation. That's not correct. So it enables DSP pooling. So we do not need it if we don't have multiple voice cards in multiple subslots. There's another command under voice card 0, and that is DSP services DSP farm. That actually does enable those DSP services or sorry, those DSPs to be allocated to the various functions that we want, MTP, transcoder, and conference bridge. Okay, so I wanted to clear those up. Wanted to make sure everyone is familiar or understands clearly what DSP pooling is, which is the command DSP farm under a voice card interface. What the difference between complexities is and how to configure each. Codec complexity medium, codec complexity high, codec complexity flex is the default. We typically want to leave it there. So that chip by chip they can determine whether they're using high or medium complexities. Medium obviously uses less channels, so therefore maximizes our resources better. And it's allocated dynamically when a call comes in and begins using a function like voice termination or one of the DSP farm services. Okay, so let's continue. So low complexity codecs, as we looked at, are those such as here, are those such as 711, Clear Channel, which we'll talk a little more about tomorrow. That essentially allows for, if we had two PINCs, private internet exchange, so two PBXs at two different sites, and maybe we wanted to use a PRI from a call manager or even just a regular standard iOS router as a voice gateway, linked into each of the PBXs, one voice gateway on each side, one PRI on each side, linked into each PBX on each side. And we essentially wanted to have a clear 64K channel similar to the codec requirements of G711 or G722, but not those codecs. So it's essentially just passing the voice through. Our medium complexity codecs are G722, G726, G729 Annex A, so that includes the variants AR8 and ABR8, and then our high complexity codecs being G729 straight R8, G729 Annex B, which enables the VAD, as we mentioned, G723, 728, Internet low bitrate codec, and then GSM and modem relay. Okay. Looking at PVDM2 codec support. We're not going to take a look at PVDM1, the original, the C549 chips, or any of the other chipsets, just because they're really not relevant to not only not our lab, we will briefly look at PVDM3s just because they're relevant to real life, probably much more so today. However, the voice lab, at least right now, probably for about the next 2 years, still uses the PVDM2s and the ISR routers. So this is a breakdown of where the complexities fall, which we already took a look at, high, medium, and low. This shows us the breakdown of medium and high complexity, and then also flex mode in terms of the millions of instructions per second. Okay, notice what is not in here. PVDM2s do not support G722 or the ILBC codec. PVDM3s bring in support at that point for the ILBC codec as a high complexity and the G722 as a medium complexity. And there's even a very high complexity. We'll get into that because it's really not relevant to the lab or what we're doing today. Okay, so any question regarding any of the codecs, any of their complexities, or anything else before we begin talking about some of the various media components, being MTP, conference bridging, transcoding, various things like that?